And hey, everybody, before I pass it over to Mark to lead the show, a quick intro on me. I'm Kelly Mack, partner at Workbench. We're an enterprise tech-focused VC fund based in New York, and we invest in early-stage startups throughout the country in $3 to $6 million rounds, and we are obsessed with all things enterprise sales and go-to-market. And so, as an enterprise fund, we host a variety of events from the New York Enterprise Tech Meetup to the CIO Perspectives webinars, and it's our way to unite our amazing community across suits and hoodies. I'd love to connect with any of you after this event, especially if you're focused on infrastructure, security, and privacy. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Mark to get everything started.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Kelly. Well, I really look forward to this session today. I'm joined by two experts in the field of privacy management, and really experts in the sense that the companies they're in, I mean, they deal with these issues day in and day out. And so with no further ado, I'm going to let Phil and Karthik introduce themselves. I don't think, the Gap and Robinhood need a whole lot of introduction in terms of what their companies do. But guys, if you could get us started, maybe just describe your role at your company. Phil, you want to get us going?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here to your webinar. I'm Phil Glebow. I lead the enterprise architecture function here at Gap. We're both a consulting function, and we also have accountability for delivery and strategy. It's spread across essentially the United States, India, and we have several partners all over the globe. Karthik?
Hey everyone, I am Karthik Rangarajan. I'm a principal security engineer at Robinhood. I also happen to be Robinhood's first security engineer. I built out the team, led the group as a director, and then transitioned back into a core engineering role because I found computers a lot more fun to work with directly. I work on day-to-day, I work on finding new technology, finding new solutions to the same old problems and trying to innovate in the problem space as much as possible.
So I suspect with the audience we have today, we don't need to waste a lot of upfront time here talking about how important privacy data management is. Probably people wouldn't have tuned in or joined us today if they hadn't already come to that realization. And I think it's also pretty obvious that, financial service industry that Karthik, you operate in, and the retail industry, Phil, that you operate in, privacy concerns are pretty paramount. These are not B2B businesses. You're dealing with consumers and you have more exposure to PII data than a lot of other industries would have. And so Karthik, maybe I'll stay with you for a minute. Can you give a little more insight into the nature of the PII that you guys manage and what, some of the more sensitive forms of it actually are?
Yeah, absolutely. As we're a financial services company, like you said, we are a broker dealer, we have a crypto business. And as part of our business, we have to know our customers. And to know our customers, we need to collect a whole range of personal information: first names, last names, date of birth, social security numbers, home addresses, things like that. We also, in certain cases, collect information about spouses or other trusted contacts that they may have so that we can serve customers in adverse situations and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of personal information that we're collecting and that we are responsible for securing and ensuring that they remain private as they enter our systems and go through the life cycle of supporting the customer. So while we don't today collect things like credit card numbers or friend lists or your social preferences, we do collect what most people would consider their private data, which is, as I said, social security numbers, home addresses, workplace information, salary information, things like that. So fairly sensitive data that we deal with.
It's interesting, that spousal connection, that wouldn't have been obvious to me. I wouldn't have actually thought about that. How about Phil, how about you?
I think, as you can imagine, anything that's necessary to get you something you ordered on a website, your name, your address, phone number, email, all of that is PII that we collect and maintain and protect. This is a very serious responsibility for us. We have a direct relationship with many of our customers, and we really want to make sure that people are very comfortable and trust us with their data. And that's very important to us.
So Phil, I'm going to stick with you. I kind of want to pose the first conundrum of privacy data management, and that is kind of as follows. The way in which modern corporations increasingly work, as we all know, is highly virtual. We've got, we spent 2 decades breaking down kind of a very classic hierarchical corporation. We encourage teamwork across functional boundaries. We encourage partnering with third parties. We encourage use of specialized contractors and consultants that can bring skills into the company that we don't have ready access to, et cetera. So like work keeps morphing all the time, right? There's all these practices that go on based on the needs of the company. So that's what's happening in terms of the way that work gets done. Then if you look at the technology we have available to control and manage this privacy data, it's become increasingly granular, and things like encryption and redaction and other forms of obfuscation can be applied at really like a row level or column level or a cell level. So you've got work becoming more amorphous and the control safeguards becoming more granular, which creates the conundrum of policy management. You know, how do you manage policy on a centralized basis versus decentralized basis? And I'm sure that both organizations, you've had to think about this. So Phil, how do you wrap your mind around that problem of how much centralized policy management and enforcement can be done, you know, in a large extended enterprise like the Gap, with all these different forms of work going on, you know, in a way that makes effective use of the safeguards?
Sure. So I think, you know, we certainly have a number of policies that govern access to PII at both the, you know, identity, network, and data levels. You know, we use obviously technical measures like encryption and tokenization. So, you know, from a policy perspective, we have an InfoSec group that, along with our CIO function, governs those policies. And, you know, I think if you look a little bit deeper down, you know, we encrypt obviously PII. PCI data, so credit card information, is tokenized once it hits our systems. And if we have to move data internally, you know, picture kind of an encrypted and tokenized blob is how we sort of store or move that around. PCI is dealt with a little bit differently. It's much stronger in the way that we control it. Segmented networks and other techniques, for example. And I think from also a policy perspective, you know, we restrict access to PII to really only those people that have a legitimate need to access it. So, you know, as an example, if we have a group of customers that sign up for an event or promotion or something like that, if we're interested in the count of people that have done that or some statistics, we don't necessarily need to give users access to that PII, so we don't. You know, we'll hash it or employ some technique like that.
Just to follow up, so if hypothetical, let's say there's a machine learning modeling team or whatever, contains members who wouldn't have normally in their, you know, roles have access to certain forms of PII. Would there be some delegation responsibility that would say, hey, this team and this sub-organization, they can make their own call, and maybe for the next 6 weeks or whatever, somebody who would historically not have access to certain kinds of sensitive data will have access as long as they're on this team?
You know, we do monitor that pretty carefully and pretty heavily. We tend not to give individual teams discretion when it comes to PII. That's much more of a centralized function. Access, for example, is ephemeral. It's not like you get it once and you keep it forever. So we employ techniques like that as well.
Cool. Karthik, how about you? How do you wrap your mind around that contrast between, you know, amorphous work and then highly granular safeguards?
Yeah, that's a tough problem. We do a lot of the things that Phil just described, but I think the main difference for us is that we are a 100% AWS shop, which means that all of our data lives in AWS, and that both makes it easier and harder. It makes it easier because there's just one place that we need to govern things in. It makes it harder because, as everyone knows, AWS, you know, S3, while on paper it's one place, it's not really one place. There's, you know, anybody can create a bucket, the information can move around, the sprawl of the data lake can get pretty big. And so when we think about giving access to personal information and controlling access to personal information, I think we think about it in two ways. One is what needs access and who needs access. What needs access being these services need access to perform their jobs. And for them, we're much less restrictive about how give access depending on how the service is architected and what it needs. And then there's the who needs access, which is the humans, where we are a lot more restrictive with ephemeral access and access policies and governing as close to the data as possible. And so when we separate it this way, it makes it a little bit easier to architect our data lake and separate the data lake into this part of the data lake has not personal information as classified by whatever definition, and hence can be used for the following purposes. This part of the data lake is more restrictive. It can only be used for the following reasons, and for the following, whether that be processing, whether that be humans, whether that be machine learning, whatever it might be. And we're much more restrictive about who gets access to this and how often they get access to it. Whereas with the farmer, this is not necessarily very sensitive personal information, or it may be authorized by the privacy engineering team or privacy legal team for broader access. There we are more, and this might be because they are hashed or tokenized or anonymized in some way, so they may not be directly tied back to the user. And so this is what we give access to our machine learning team, to our research teams, things like that, to perform their information, whereas this more segregated part of the data lake that has highly sensitive information is restricted to only those that need it for the period of time that they need it. And we have internal tools that we've built to segregate this access based on people's roles and responsibilities.
Cool, great, thanks. Okay, this time, Karthik, I'll stick with you, and I'm going to move on to conundrum number 2. Okay, so as you both know, after the SolarWinds cyber attack, the public press woke up and said, "Gee, there's actually like security vulnerabilities that can be incurred through the relationships that you have with your suppliers or partners or whatever. Bad stuff can come in through avenues that we haven't really thought a whole lot about, that's the public view of it. Other people had thought about that. That's not like a new revelation." And of course, most of the commentary that came out of that whole event or scenario really had to do with trying to secure companies from malware or paths towards a breach, things that could be inserted in. And the thing that's always really difficult to differentiate with privacy data is the points you both made in here in the conversation so far. You can do the wrong thing in just the way the data is handled or shared, and it doesn't have to be breached or go outside the walls of the corporation or whatever. So if you think about the SolarWinds paranoia that sprung up, a very legitimate paranoia, and you apply that to the mishandling problem, how do you think about these like 2 scenarios to guard against this? So in your dealings with third parties, you could actually acquire or have access to PII information and not be fully informed of the terms and conditions that apply to it, that were not passed along to you or weren't, handled in the proper way so that you fully understand the restrictions that apply to that data. Or correspondingly, you could have a downstream partner where you've passed some form of information to the partner, and they might, even if you've informed them, they may, not enforce those controls or restrictions, and then, they misuse it in some fashion or another. So what practices or policies or, how do you think about addressing those 2 problems, both on like the inbound side where, you may actually have access to information, and then on the outbound side where you've actually supplied it to a third party?
Yeah, the process for this has evolved over time as we've understood the challenges better and understood kind of the different operational constraints of this. So, the obvious blanket answer is everyone goes through a review, but we all know that reviews don't answer all the questions you need, or they may not get you everything you need. So we've instituted a privacy by design process. So basically any new vendor, any new product, any new feature that we build has to go through a privacy by design process. And the privacy by design process involves our privacy engineering team, as well as a privacy legal team. And we look at every aspect of the product, feature, vendor that you're bringing on. So I'll give an example of an event that I recently brought on to do some work around security and fraud. Now, obviously, this vendor is going to get some sensitive data from us in order to signal something as fraudulent or not fraudulent, and they will need to be processing this. They'll need to be perhaps sharing it in some way, or if they're operating a consortium model, we'll need to figure out how this consortium works. And there's all of these different components that we have to think through. And so the privacy engineering and privacy legal team get together with the implementer, i.e. me in this case, and they give me a list of questions. And then I go to the vendor, I ask them, and these go pretty deep. And we very explicitly ask, do you use this data for the purposes of sharing it with other customers? Do you use this data to further your business? Does this contribute to your revenue stream? If you were to change the way you're processing this data, how would you tell us? And so we go pretty deep in asking these questions, and we get the answers documented on paper. What that helps us do is then we develop our DPAs and our legal agreements so that their answers are actually encoded in the form of a legal contract they're signing with us. Now, that does not guarantee that they don't misuse this information, but it gives us some safeguards on our users, some safeguards around how they're going to be using this information. We can't, again, this is protections that we can get versus, to a certain extent, legal guarantees that you can get. On the other side of it, inbound, that's the other place that the privacy by design process catches it. Again, in the same instance of this vendor, we are ingesting a whole bunch of data around user behavior and what fraudulent actors look like. We should make sure that this information does not get used by, say, a growth team or a marketing team to identify users that are really against users that had really good behavior and pattern match against users that had different behavior or something like that. So the privacy team then puts restrictions on the use of this data and expects us to build our engineering systems in such a way that this data cannot be misused. And they can, that goes back to my previous answers around access policies and who has access to data, but also fundamentally around how the systems are protected. Make sure that the system does not use a data store that is used by 10 other systems for completely different purposes. If you're building a system that is processing highly sensitive information, limit your data store to be only used by the system and no other systems. If that changes, we are expected to go back and go through the privacy by design process again.
It's almost like a network segmentation architectural design applied to data stores.
Yeah, it's very similar to that. Absolutely, it's very similar to that.
Okay. So Phil, same question. Third-party data either inbound to you or outbound to a partner?
Sure. So I think, I'll cover this in maybe two ways. We have sort of a policy approach and some technical solutions. From a policy perspective, we have a very strong data classification policy. And then we also review very in-depth any third-party application that we use. We have the questionnaire that we initially send to the vendor, but we do threat modeling, we do pen testing, we do a lot of just analysis of that software that we bring in that deals with this information. Where we exchange information with third parties, generally require a SOC 2 certification, and really prefer to work with larger established vendors. The theory being that there would be less of a chance of, just sort of basic privacy practices. Also, on our site, we monitor third-party products to make sure that they're not accessing more data than they actually need to. They're not putting, strange cookies on the website, so forth, so on. We also, I think, culturally, internally work with our product management folks, our engineering teams, to make sure that privacy is something that they're thinking about. So we have annual trainings, we have discussions, we have people come to various meetings so that this topic is always, at the top of everyone's mind. And it's something that we consider when we design systems and when we, buy vendor products and so forth.
So my next question is really an architectural one. So Phil, I'm going to start with you. Let's say over the past, 5+ years, a lot of the safeguards that are applied to privacy data are available in the form of modular SaaS services. So, you kind of, you build some kind of a application for commercial use. Then after the fact, you realize that you want to encrypt some data. So you apply encryption to it, or you have new access policies that you want enforced. So you use a third party, access control service, and you apply that to that platform. And as is happening in a lot of other places, many of those services now can actually be, embedded in in terms of software into newly designed systems. They can either be exposed as API calls, embedded in, or they can actually be things like authentication, encryption, certain forms of data movement monitoring, et cetera, can be integrally embedded into the new platform itself. So it's not applied as a modular service kind of after the fact. So in those kind of design patterns, I'm kind of curious whether there's a philosophy going forward of trying to really kind of exploit that privacy as code approach in building the systems, or whether the existing modular capabilities are sufficient and you have experience with those and you choose to rely on them as kind of a primary design pattern going forward.
I think it's kind of a mix. As we're migrating to Kubernetes, there's a big opportunity to look at our build pipelines and to go through and start to include things, like static analysis, pen testing, and some security specific tools as just part of the development of that application. So I'd say, privacy as code, really that concept is very much something that we practice and are looking to expand as we get further into, Kubernetes. There are also essentially design patterns as you move to cloud, centralized key vaults, those types of techniques make the secure thing the easy thing to do. And I think that's an angle that we're pursuing, is really trying to focus on that developer experience. Make it easy, make it fun, but also make it secure by providing some of these centralized capabilities. But there are also things that don't naturally fit into a build pipeline. If you want to do some really complex penetration testing, for example, that doesn't necessarily work each build. That's something maybe that you have to test periodically. So I think, to the extent that it takes a long period of time, that might be something that we have in a different stage of our SDLC.
Just to follow up, do you think that some of the privacy as code vendors, the developers, from my perspective or experience, like a lot of these capabilities are coming from companies that are still at maybe a seed stage or a Series A stage. So, the vision is great. In some cases, they really, haven't really kind of built out the full functionality of the vision that they're espousing. Have you been disappointed at the maturity of those tools, or do you have more of a wait and see attitude, or have you started to actually use some in practice?
We've started to use some. I think, it's an evolving area. We try and keep a very open mind. And I think sometimes we work with groups that are very small, that are startup companies. And part of that engagement with them is helping them to evolve their product. So, it's a two-way street. They get requirements from us, and we get some, specialized stuff developed that's very helpful to our developers.
So Karthik, how far down the road has Robinhood gone in terms of exploiting the policy as code kind of a framework?
We've started on the path for sure. I think in general, we are very much a access code shop. So infrastructure as code, security as code. So it's only natural that we would go down the path of privacy as code direction as well. And for us, it's a combination. The story is a combination of what vendors can give us versus what we can build in-house versus what open source platforms we can use. So I've seen at least for me, I break it down into three sort of problem spaces. One is classification and labeling. The other is monitoring who has access. And the third is verifying that the people that we think have access actually have access, or that there aren't some weird complicated things happening. I think 1 and 2 are obviously can be encoded as as code somewhere, or as like a data specification language of some sort. I think number 3 is where I haven't yet seen great ways of doing it without it being very manual, or it's difficult to automate some of it, and that's kind of where we're investing both engineering resources as well as looking into some very early stage companies that are built. But I think, honestly, privacy as code we're very much in the beginning stages of it. I think everyone to a certain extent is in the beginning stages of it. And the space, in my opinion, to answer your question of that you asked Phil about how are some of the companies here doing, given that they're very early stage. My experience is whenever companies specialize, where they try to solve one problem and solve it really well, I see them doing much better than when somebody tries to solve multiple different problems at the same time, where because of the problems, each problem is so niche and complicated, they get to 10% of a solution in each thing, and that becomes less useful as a whole.
That's a great observation. So Karthik, I'm going to follow up with you and kind of go off on a different direction here. So during the introductions, and I know that you work in a privacy engineering team. So Robinhood has a team of people that think, eat, drink, and live and breathe privacy every day. A lot of other companies of different scale or in different lines of business, may not be able to dedicate resources exclusively to privacy. And I think we all know in those situations, the InfoSec team, the conventional InfoSec team, inherits some of these kind of responsibilities. But in many cases, this is not on the career path of like a classic InfoSec engineer or even an InfoSec ops person that would be in a SOC. So if I was, maybe there's people even listening in. So if I wanted to get into this field, would a path through information security, classic information security, be a good introduction or kind of a mental framework, to work in and then move over to privacy? Or are the two areas, really so fundamentally different that it's almost counterproductive to get inculcated with like the InfoSec mindset, and then you come over and go, well, unlearn half of what they just told you, because mishandling is the big thing here. We're not the breaches. Yeah, we need to worry about breaches, but there's a whole other regime of problems that we deal with. So how do you?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's interesting. Like a year ago, if you'd asked me this question, I would have said, yeah, there's no difference. It's if you become a security expert, you can easily translate that into privacy skills. And that was when my privacy team was 2 people. And a year later, when the privacy team has grown and I've learned from them, it is same but different. A lot of the skill sets are very similar. It's about critical thinking. It is about system design. It is about adversarial modeling, things like that. But where from a security standpoint, we care that this data is protected and that it is, there is no breach, it's encrypted, things like that. But we don't necessarily care as much about whether the growth team or the marketing team use this data. We're like, yeah, it's encrypted, let's make sure we limit access. Whereas with privacy, you actually care deeply about who uses this data and what purposes they use it for. And I think to answer your question directly, it is absolutely possible for somebody with a more classic information security background to then wear a privacy hat and think like a privacy person, but there is a mindset shift involved. I think one of the things I often say to people is privacy and security are very similar. You can't have one without the other. You can't have private information without securing it. You can't have secure information without privacy coming in and saying how this information should be used. Because there's no point in saying, I'm going to lock this thing down and say have access policies if your access policy are star. And that's what the privacy team tells you is, what should your access policies look like? Who should get access to this data? Why should they get access to this data? And so they do go hand in hand. The skill sets are very similar. There is a mindset shift involved, whereas from a security person standpoint, you're thinking of an attacker. As a privacy person, you're not thinking of an attacker, you're thinking of well-intentioned misuse. And they're similar but different.
Yep, that's a good qualifier as well. I did a little online research. I was looking around at universities that actually offer degrees in privacy engineering. And I guess I was pleasantly surprised. There are a handful, the 2 that I remember offhand. Carnegie Mellon offers a master's level degree in privacy engineering, and I believe Northeastern does as well. And there might be 1 or 2 others that I'm forgetting about, but it's obviously not it's not a widespread thing, even though a lot of campuses offer various types of information security, degrees and certificates.
Yeah, one thing I'll quickly add on to that is, there's one skill that is hard to learn without getting into privacy is this concept of data, the data modeling as a privacy engineer is very different from data modeling as a security engineer. As a security engineer, you're relying on the people that are handling the data to tell you how it's architected, and you're basically advising on how it should work. Whereas as a privacy engineer, you have a direct role in helping model this data. And so how you think about data modeling is very different for a privacy engineer versus a security engineer.
That's great. That's great qualification. So Phil, what's been the experience at the Gap? Have you built out a privacy dedicated team, kind of leveraging InfoSec skills that were already there?
I think it's still under the umbrella of InfoSec. We certainly have folks, I think, that focus on privacy exclusively, but I think this is more in the InfoSec model. And I think from my perspective, developers are very central to what we do, and getting those folks up to speed on security, privacy, the issues, really educating them, providing them the tools. That's one of the avenues that we're producing or following to sort of produce more secure software and better practices in general.
Okay, well, this has been a great discussion. I kind of want to end on a fun question, kind of a speculative question. And I want you both to step out of character as representatives of the Gap or Robinhood. So one of the things that's really intrigued me over the last couple of months are all the moves that Apple has been making to really become kind of a thought leader in the privacy space, especially from a consumer point of view. So obviously everybody knows that they're going to suspend sharing of data through third-party cookies. And at the recent conference they had, their WWDC, I think they're even thinking about or possibly have announced actually revenue services, like extra fee for privacy type services where data will be handled or protected in a different way. And so, I kind of think there's these three stages of dealing with privacy. First is just bare bones regulatory compliance. Then you think about competitive advantage. Can we at least be able to look over our shoulder at others and say we're doing it better than they are? But this, this highest level of consciousness of actually turning it into a revenue stream just had never occurred to me until Apple, pulled this rabbit out of the hat. So again, I'm not trying to ask you to make a policy statement for Robinhood or the Gap, but I mean, do you see? But you deal with large numbers of consumers, and so you kind of have some insight into their behaviors. Do you think we're approaching a point in time in 2 to 3 years when people will pay, or be willing to be charged some kind of an incremental fee to have their data handled in a different way? Phil, what do you think first?
Yeah, I think we already see privacy protection as a service. So password managers are a good example. ID theft monitoring, threat detection, recovery services. So I think those things are out there. I guess from my perspective, though, if we were to move to a model where you get a different tier of privacy from a provider, if you pay a bigger fee, I think that's going to invite a lot of regulatory scrutiny. And I think, a lot of consumers would be very concerned about access, equality, a lot of those types of issues. And so I would think that's probably not a great idea to have a different tier of privacy based on how much you pay. But certainly there are tools out there that help with this today.
Yeah. What do you think, Karthik?
Yeah, so I think, while this is still evolving, there are some solutions here that are trying to do better for privacy, like Brave, the browser, for instance, incentivizes you to watch ads and things like that. And you get coins, or I haven't used Brave in a while, but you get coins or something like that for participating in ads. I think, not speaking for Robinhood, but personally, I think that if a company were to tell me, hey, this is how we use your data, this is exactly what we do with it, and yes, we may be using it for our own revenue streams or all of these things, here's a way to opt out of it. But also, if that's completely transparent about what they're doing with the data and giving the control to users, I think I like that aspect. Aspect would be, by default, we will not use your data for any advertising or any growth purposes. However, if we will pay you this amount of money because we're data that way. I think that approach would also be really good, because if you're going to be using users' data to grow your company, it's only fair that the user gets a portion of your revenue because of this, given that they are, quote unquote, the product for that you're building on top of. So I like both of those approaches. I don't think it would be fair for users to have to pay to get better privacy handling, for sure.
Just to close this one off, people may have forgotten, but when CCPA legislation was being debated in the California legislature, one of the concepts that was debated was monetization of PII. So once you have it in your possession, if you use it in certain ways, maybe beyond what the initial expectation was, that the consumer could actually receive a discount or a credit or, some form of financial monetization for future use of privacy data. So that I'm sure that discussion will reappear somewhere downstream. Okay, Kelly, what kind of questions have we seen from the audience?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Great conversation. I'll pick some questions from the audience. The first one that I got, and I know that a bunch of you, well, both of you had already talked about some of the processes and technologies that you're utilizing here, but one person asked, how do you keep track of where sensitive data is stored and how it is being moved and processed throughout your applications and to and from users? And I know that, yeah, you've already talked about some of that privacy engineering practice, but I wonder if you could speak to any of the specific tools, companies that are currently being used here.
I can take a shot at this without sort of, obviously should not be taken as a recommendation of a company or anything like that, but we use a company called Borneo to actually help us keep track of some of this. So Borneo sits and monitors our S3 buckets, our Presto clusters, and things like that, and that's able to give us some level of awareness around data provenance, which is where does this data start, where did this data end up, how does it travel through our systems. It's a work in progress, but that's kind of the goal of it. So there are many other solutions out here, like OpenRaven is building something cool. There's obviously Big ID, Alation. There's a whole bunch of different vendors here, depending on how you're trying to solve it. But looking at data provenance and figuring out how data moves through your systems.
Phil, you want to?
Yeah, I think from the Gap perspective, we're heavily involved with Azure, so there are a number of tools that Microsoft provides, and it can be very basic. So things like you only have access, only particular accounts have access. They're audited. We have certainly alarms and so forth if things are happening that are outside of the ordinary. We have a number of monitoring and metrics type of tools that we use to do that. Both from Microsoft and from others.
Got it. Another question to follow up here is, I know that both of you have talked a lot through the different processes and getting tactical on how things are working from a privacy engineering side inside of both of your companies, but what are the areas that are still hard for privacy? Whether that's the ability to use tools to look for certain types of data, or even organizational challenges within companies. Would love to hear more about what are those challenges that still exist that any entrepreneurs on the line should, maybe start focusing some of their time.
Sure, I think I'll give you a couple of my thoughts on that. I think the sheer volume of data that we're now confronted with is a real difficult problem to handle, because we want to move quickly. We want to provide new experiences to our customers, but at the same time, we have to model that information. We have to make sure that it's secure and so forth. So structuring that information, dealing with the huge volume of that information that's coming in, and making sure that we have appropriate metrics and things that don't necessarily require an engineering team's focus, maybe more an exception-based type of a tool. Those are things I think that are still very challenging as information comes in.
One perspective I'll add here is, I agree with everything Phil said, obviously, but one perspective I'll add is, in the early stages of building out the privacy team and the program, it was really difficult to define privacy. We weren't really sure, like there's as a financial services company, we have GLBA and a bunch of things that come from the SEC and FINRA and New York and stuff like that. And then you add on CCPA to that. And for companies that are operating in the Europe, you have GDPR, and then there's state level privacy laws. And so the definition of privacy can get pretty wonky over time, and it's going to be really, it can get very difficult to establish even simple rules around how you handle privacy incident response and how you separate things like privacy incident response from security incident response. Are they different? How are they different? Like some of those things can get really complicated and really difficult to answer unless you have a really strong legal team and a strong engineering team. And that's not always a luxury that some of the smaller companies can afford to have. Like Robinhood has the ability to do that. And I'm glad that we have the bench strength to be able to go and say, we're going to recruit top tier lawyers and top tier engineers to answer these questions for us. But I've worked with a lot of smaller companies that don't have that ability because of various reasons. And I think if there is a way to help companies define what privacy goals they need to meet more clearly, I think that would be very helpful.
Great. And then actually the last question there, and Karthik, you brought up a good point around the challenges around from a legal perspective with everything changing so often. I guess on both of your ends, anything coming up in the next couple of near-term years or long-term years that you are excited for, that you are expecting that will change the landscape?
I think I'll start here. Like I think CCPA is just the beginning of a state level privacy law, and New York is coming out of their own. Massachusetts is coming out of their own. Each state is going to come out of their own, and it's going to make things really complicated and difficult to handle from a legal perspective. Engineering wise, it might not be all that more complicated, but from a legal perspective, you might need to serve a different privacy policy or figure out how to write your privacy policy broadly enough that it works across 50 states. And as well as, serve different content for Europe and, stuff like that. So I think state level privacy laws are going to add an interesting curveball to this whole situation.
I'd agree with that. I think, to the extent, at least in the United States, where, we would have a more federal approach to that, I think that would be a simplification. And that might not happen in the short term, but I would see business groups pushing for that as we go forward. I think some of the other things that we're looking at a little bit are the concept of differential privacy. Mm-hmm. And some of those techniques. It's a little bit different, I think, maybe in retail. But there are certain instances where we're investigating whether or not that would be something that would be helpful to us and to our consumers.
So you want to define that there's probably some people that may not be familiar with that concept.
Yeah, so essentially, we want to be able to give people access to aggregates about data. With some amount of error is how I would define that. So, we wouldn't necessarily make a query and mark find your email address, but or your address physically, but we might want to know how many people are within a certain geographic area. And the idea is that if we took your information out of that set, we wouldn't be able to know whether or not it was there or wasn't. So essentially, it gives you some level of privacy protection, but at the same time allows you to perform statistical analysis across those data sets.
I'm going to chime in here, but really not so much on the regulation, but it is interesting. There are very few forums where you can go and talk tech with other privacy engineers or privacy professionals. And there's a whole bunch of privacy symposia that are filled with people in regulatory bodies and who are legal firms and whatever. And, I see advertisements all the time on email and I think, oh, that would be cool. I'd like to take a look at that agenda. Maybe I'll swoop in and listen in on one or two, conversations. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty thin gruel. Carnegie Mellon has an annual, I think it's a 2-day thing. It just occurred. So there's another organization called Future Privacy, I think, that is just starting up. They're trying to hold a couple of conferences that are a little more technically oriented as well. But I tell you right now, the lawyers and the regulators kind of control the conversation at most of these kind of meetings, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a good point. I always wonder how much of the privacy challenge is a legal one, to Karthik's point around how you interpret the laws or how the laws are implemented, or or the technology side on the ability to find, categorize, actually compute and analyze your data. I'm sure it's in between all of that, but it's definitely a massive, massive challenge. And I guess to end, the last question I have is that privacy data is only one type of data within all of your companies. There's also other types of sensitive information like intellectual property. And I guess, how does privacy data or securing privacy data fit into an overall data security strategy? Can you use the same tools, or is there a specific subset of tools that need to be used?
I'll go first here again. I think you can use the same tools. I don't think there is much of a difference in securing your data from a privacy perspective or not from a privacy perspective. I think there's a lot of the same tools that you use to secure your data can be used for securing what you consider privacy specific data as well. I think the challenges come with the processing of it. So even when you've secured it, how do you how do you limit processing of it, and how do you ensure that it is processed by the right people, services, systems? I think that's where the challenges are, and that's where you'll need different tools. But in terms of core security and architecture, I don't think it's going to be significantly different from the tools that already exist.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think there are, I think as Karthik mentioned, some specialized tools to control access internally and to give people perhaps a wider view if you're the CFO, for example. But generally, I think the techniques are the same.
Let me counterpoint here. I think a lot of times our identity and access management tools evolved with really their primary target being applications, access to applications, the authorizations you had for certain privileges, et cetera. And as you get into the world of unstructured data and data stores and all, data becomes so fluid and distributed that some of the concepts are the same, but a lot of the security safeguards that have been designed in the past were really kind of application motivated or initially application focused, and they start to break down in a vastly disaggregated world of unstructured data resources. So that's great. We filled the time, Kelly. Thanks to Karthik and Phil.
Yeah,
thanks for taking the time today. This has been great.
Thank
Kelly,
you.
wrap us up.
Absolutely. Yeah, Mark, thank you so much for moderating. Phil, Karthik, thanks for joining and sharing your perspectives. For everybody in the audience today, really appreciated you joining. Thanks for the questions. And yep, for those of you who are new to us, we have our Enterprise Weekly newsletter that we send out every Friday. Make sure to sign up for that. And we have a bunch of technical playbooks and technical content on our blog. It's great to, hopefully I get to meet a bunch of you, but we plan to host a bunch of these webinars going forward. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the summer.
Super.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.